Hey everyone, this is Nate Ferguson here, and this is Yeast Basics 2, Module 3, Lecture 1 of 2. And today's problem is one that's a bit more complicated than most. This is one of these topics that has a lot of nuance to it, a lot of different variables to it, and isn't clean. We're going to talk about that a bunch. Today we're talking about pitch rate and what the correct or right pitch rate is. Now, this viewpoint of what a correct or adequate pitch rate is doesn't really fully explain the topic or importance of why pitch rate is important or how altering it is going to improve the quality of or decrease the quality of your beer. So today we're going to explore this. We're going to be exploring what pitch rate is, what factors go in determining the right, air quotes, pitch rate is, and how pitch rate impacts the quality of beer and your culture's quality. Now, before we start, I want to do a little bit of a thank you, a little bit of a call out. Before we begin, I need to thank Reddit, and mainly I need to thank Cascades Brewer on Reddit. Now, Reddit is not a place I frequent often, but every now and then I pop on there just to see what's going on. And one of those times, I saw a discussion forum about the first series we did, Yeast Basics 1. Through that, I had a little conversation with some people, mainly Cascades Brewer here, and from that conversation spawned this lecture today. So, tip of the hat, thank you. If it wasn't for him or her, this lecture today wouldn't exist. So thanks. Now, the standard disclaimer, as always, the goal of this series is to educate and advise you on applications of yeast in the brewery to avoid common yeast problems. We'll be breaking things down, simplifying some things into their basic components, which sometimes means we glance over details. It also sometimes means that we go into some areas that are more anecdotal than analytic, and that is unfortunately the area we find ourselves today, which often I find the more anecdotal things become, the more controversial things become, so I'm preparing myself a bit. Now, the TLDR for today's lecture, the too long didn't read, is 1. Pitch rate is condition specific to a very large degree. Pitch rate can be more or less be important based on a bunch of other different factors and what you're trying to achieve. Pitch rate isn't this gold standard, if it's not this, it's not right. It's more nebulous and a bit more gray than that. 2, pitch rate is influenced by many factors. Aeration rate, fermentation geometry, nutrient availability, all sorts of different things play a role into pitch rate. Pitch rate is much more malleable than you'd expect. It is a range, not a certain target, and it's really important to keep that in mind. And most importantly, if there's one thing I want you to take away from today, healthy cells are far greater than a properly pitched culture. Low viability is bad, even if the pitch rate is accounted for. We're going to go into this more today. Healthy cells trumps everything. Now, I mentioned this a little bit already, but I find that this topic, whenever I bring it up, it's not clean. It's not a clear, concise, because of how multivariable it is, and it tends to people tend to be a little bit let down by it. It tends to not be a simple, pitch X number of cells per hectoliter to produce high quality beer. There is no easy executable from it. It's more complicated. A more accurate answer would be something along the lines of pitch between X and Y number of healthy cells per hectoliter with high nutrient work, properly aerated for the strain in order to produce high quality beer. It's not clean. It's a work in process for every single brewer. We're trying to strike a balance, and that's going to be a theme for today's lecture. Now, we've used in the Yeast Basics 1, we use a kind of a rough analogy of something like this. An example, where if you have 1,000 units of work to do, each worker is able to complete 10 units of work. Therefore, we need 100 workers. 1,000 divided by 10, 100 workers. This is how much most pitch rate calculators work. Say we have 1,000 liters of 10-degree Plato wort, which is equivalent to about 100,000 grams of fermentables. Your strain is commonly pitched at 1 million cells per mil per degree Plato, which means we need 10 trillion cells. This is the same idea, and it leaves out a glaring amount of complexity that we will be diving into today. And then we'll cycle that back and show how that impacts what we talk about as pitch rate. Now, lecture breakdown. Today we're going to be talking just repitching. We're going to start off with why healthy cells are important. We're going to talk about cell vitality versus viability. We're going to be using Arnold Schwarzenegger a lot today because he's a great example for this. And we're going to be looking at different pitch rates and how they're going to influence different strains and then answer some common questions about this. So we'll jump into it. So we'll start off with a little example, or a little thought question, thought process. You need 10 trillion cells. Would you rather have 10 trillion cells that are 100% viable, 10T, or 15 trillion cells that are 66% viable? Now, the difference between these two, is there one? We both have 10 trillion cells of viable cells. And this is where we see a handful of our clients get into. Now, In my mind, when I look at this is a very easy question for me to answer. I want option 1. I'm looking for those 10 trillion cells that are 100% viable. We'll get to this in the end. 100% viable is not achievable. I put it in here as a keep the math easy. But option 1, those cells are each going to be happier and healthier. Those are higher quality cells if they're effectively 100%. In my experience, brewers often overestimate the importance of healthy cells, and that's a really bad idea. We're going to spend some time on it. Now, one of the most common problems we encounter when we see clients having issues repitching is that the issue repitching is almost a red herring or a false lead for what's actually going on. What's actually the problem here is that they're having issues keeping their culture happy and healthy. Now, this can be due to a bunch of different things. Things we talked about in other lectures. It can be poor aeration, it can be lack of nutrients, prolonged storage, usually in fermenter cones, or harvesting yeast too late or improper harvest of the cells whenever they do it. Or it can be, in extreme cases, some serious underpitching issues. We've also had a weird, extreme cases where they thought they were casting out initially at 20 degrees C, but turns out the first heck of work comes in at 80 C, and that's what hits the yeast first. There's always oddities, but for the most cases, this is a keeping your cells healthy issue. Now, viability is how we see most people talk about this. Most people talk about yeast cell cultures when it comes to viability, meaning viability being the percent alive versus total or dead of the culture. I can have an 80% viable culture, which means that 80% of those cells, or 80 per 100 cells, are alive. And what I want us to focus on today, and I want you to change your mindset a little bit, take a step back and kind of hear me out, is that we need to focus on vitality, and that is how healthy the cell is. Now, this can be a problem because cell vitality isn't easily measured, or arguably can't be measured. We can easily analyze viability, percent alive over total. It's really easy. To emphasize this point about why vitality is important, we're not going to look at yeast for a bit. We're going to look at humans. And in particular, we're going to look at Arnold Schwarzenegger, because Arnold Schwarzenegger is great. Now, the reason I like to use Arnold Schwarzenegger before we get into it is that Arnold Schwarzenegger, he's a celebrity. He's had a larger-than-life success story, and he has gone from this huge swing. He went from being Mr. Universe here on the left-hand side, kind of set the standard for that competition. And now he is, I think, in his mid-70s, and he's older. He's still, for his age, he's in still great condition, but he is no longer Mr. Universe that we saw on the left-hand side. So we can use this, we can compare and contrast this the idea of vitality here. Both these organisms, Mr. Universes versus the Governator, which I'll be using it to describe these two, they're both alive. From a yeast cell standpoint, we would classify them both as viable. But we're looking at vitality. So we're going to run through this a little bit. So let's have, and this idea of trying to understand pitch rates, let's talk about Arnold doing a workout. Now we're going to put him through two different workouts. The first one is going to be a full body workout, kind of moderate intensity, nothing crazy, kind of a normal thing you would do at the gym. Maybe some compound movements, things like that. Mr. Universe is going to be completely fine. He's going to go through this thing and laugh and think that was, a puny workout or something like that. But the Governator is going to be pretty strained. He's not in the same condition he was. He's older. He's tired. He can't handle as much stress. Now, they're both going to be alive at the end. They're both going to be fine. The Governator may have a strain or a sprain or something like that. He may have hurt a muscle, pulled something, but they're both going to be alive and, arguably healthy at the end of it. Both still viable. Vitality between the two will be different. But now let's say we put both of them in a workout that, say, Arnold probably would have done when he was Mr. Universe, a full body, high intensity bodybuilder workout. Mr. Universe is going to be tired, but the Governator might be in the hospital. He now has a heart condition and has had a few surgeries and things like that. This isn't good. We're going to put different levels of stress on this individual, and he's going to react accordingly. When we have, say, someone who's in great condition, highly vital, we can throw tons of stress at them, and they're completely fine. If we have someone who's not in a great position, or they're just older, they're, say, an older cell line, we can throw a bunch of stress at them, and they might die. This is why vitality is important. And if we just focus on viability, we're missing this fraction. This is important part of detail. Now, let's take that a little bit and let's switch this back over to yeast. So let's assume we have a Mr. Universe style on the left-hand side yeast cell and a Governator style yeast cell. I think we all know where we're going with this. If I want to complete a normal gravity fermentation, they're both going to be okay. Mr. Universe is going to be much healthier. He's still going to be super healthy, super viable. Vitality is still going to be pretty high. Governator is probably still going to be alive, but he's going to be more depleted. Still viable. Vitality will be decreased. Now, if we want to throw these two at, say, a high gravity fermentation, something like maybe, it doesn't have to be a macro lager. It can be a 7% IPA. Mr. Universe is going to go through it. He's going to be fine. He's going to be exhausted at the end of it, but he's going to be fine. He's going to be completely alive. The Governator might hurt themselves. They'll likely throw off some more problems. They may not finish the workout. They may not finish fermenting here. They're going to have more problems, probably going to hurt themselves. Viability or the health of that individual is going to go down. This is what we see when we start looking at yeast cells. We can have two cultures that are 80% viable or 90% viable, and one outperform the other radically. This is what we find in that situation is we have essentially one culture that is full of Mr. Universe yeasts and one culture that's full of Governator yeasts. The difference is a focus on yeast cell health, and that is why this is important. So how impactful is pitch rate based on this, assuming we have all healthy cells? Now, this is where we get into kind of the opinion. I mentioned today is more analogy than it is kind of strict research, just because there isn't a lot of research on this area. If you focus on cell health, typically your pitch rate is less impactful or less meaningful. As we showed with the two different Mr. Universes and Governators, if we have a stressful situation, we ask the Governator to do more work, he can't really do it. But if we ask Mr. Universe to do it, there's no problem. If you're looking to optimize your ferments, shave hours off your batches, things like you're really trying to hone things in, then yeah, pitch rate has a big impact. Making sure you have, say, 1.2 trillion cells or a million cells per mil versus 1.1, that can save you some hours. But for the most part, for most breweries, I would strongly suggest you focus on yeast cell health and have that be the most important thing you focus on. Pitch rate as a rough approximation be like 0.5 to 0.7 or 0.8. That variance you see between those, that range, is more than sufficient as long as you have healthy yeast cells. You're trying to strike a balance here. For many brewers, pitch rate is a target, but it's not. It shouldn't be a focused exact number. Making sure your cells are healthy is the most important thing. Now, one other bit for here. If your culture's viability is variable due to, say, handling, nutrient health, storage times, all sorts of stuff, then pitch rate is also not going to be very useful for you. When we start looking at larger breweries where they're looking to shave 12 hours off, 1 day off, things like that, we're running under the assumption that the culture already is happy and healthy. Because otherwise, like I mentioned beforehand, if I have two cultures of 80% viability, one is the Governator, one is Mr. Universe, they're going to operate very differently. Very, very differently. We need to make sure that we focus on the yeast cells being happy and healthy first, and then we can dial in pitch rate. We see a lot of breweries switch this around. So to kind of update our analogy we used earlier in the presentation, or from Yeast Basics 1, the original analogy being if we have 1,000 workers 1,000 units of work to do, each worker is able to complete 10 units of work. Therefore, we need 100 workers. This is actually a better way to look at this would be something like this. If each of our workers is sick, then they're not going to be able to complete the 10 units of work that we asked them to do. They're probably going to be able to complete maybe 5, maybe none. And this is going to result in incomplete work being completed. For yeast cells, this could be incomplete fermentations and off-flavor production. They'll likely see an increase in job placement accidents, which would be off-flavor production. Now, the inverse of this, if we have super healthy yeast cells, then or in this case for workers, then our capacity of each one might go from 10 to 15. Those yeast cells are able to handle more. These workers are able to handle more. What's going to happen? We can either pitch less cells, good thing, or we're going to see the work get completed faster and there'll be less accidents. All of these are benefits by having happier, healthy yeast cells. There is no downside to having healthy yeast cells. As a slight aside, one of these things you see in some old brewing texts is, if you want to make a strain more expressive, you should try to stress it out. Don't do that. The expression you're looking for is cell death flavor, and it's nearly impossible. It's very difficult to dial in and reproduce, and you're going to be shooting your next batches in the foot. Don't do that. So that's kind of the Cole's notes for pitch rate. You notice that I haven't given you numbers for pitch rates on this, and they're strain specific. I'd ask you kind of reach out to us or look at some of the resources we have online. We have a pitch rate calculator online. You can look at those things there. I'm trying to talk this a bit more, higher level than that. Now, on the next bit, we do see large pitch rate variations between strains. Like lagers typically have a higher pitch rate than, say, Belgian ales or saisons. Saisons and Kveiks can go ridiculously low. So why is this? Now, this isn't a straightforward answer, but we're going to try and weave through this and make this as simple as we possibly can. We can break it down into a few elements. Nitrogen assimilation is a big one, and the required amount of nitrogen for that yeast cell. Ability to store energies. Different yeast cells can store different amounts of NADH, glycogen, ATP, things like that. Ability to produce sterols and their quality. We talked about this in in the first module, where different yeast cells, the quality of the sterols they produce is higher or lower. And some strains are just more energy efficient. They're just able to use the resources they have more efficiently. All these combined result in what we see when it comes to the variability between pitch rates. And pitch rates range. You're going to have to find that your brewery was going to have probably a different pitch rate than the brewery down the street based on all the different things you do. If you add more oxygen, you supply more nutrients, you use different malts, your fermenters are designed differently, they have less physical stress on the cells, their cells are handled differently, we're going to see pitch rate altered from each one of these different situations. In general, the happier and the healthier you keep your yeast cells, the less stress you place on them, the more pitch rate can be variable, and the lower the pitch rate you can go while having the same results. I would opt that you keep your yeast cells happy and healthy and take the cutoff time on ferments, but we'll get to that. Now, to just kind of dig into each one of these, oxygen has a big impact on pitch rate. We've talked about this oxygen a lot. The more oxygen you add, the more energy those cells are going to have available to them, and the more metabolic precursors they're going to have, which makes their life much, much better. If the cell has more energy, it's going to be able to handle more work, handle more stress. Decreased pitch rates can be used, or you can improve the quality of your yeast cells and decrease fermentation time, which is what I recommend you do. Now, there's one point on here I want to emphasize, and this is an important bit where we see some brewers get confused. If we were to double our pitch rate theoretically for a batch, and we kept our aeration rate the same, we are effectively only providing half the aeration for each yeast cell. Say it again. If I double my pitch rate, but I keep my aeration the same, each cell is going to have available to it half the amount of oxygen it would have normally. When you're looking at oxygen and a few other limiting nutrients, it's really important to think of things this way, where if I add more yeast cells, but I keep my aeration the same, each one is, the amount of oxygen is the same, that pie is the same size, but there's more people eating it. This can be a problem. So you have to strike a balance on this. More oxygen is always more when it comes to wort aeration. Same thing goes for vitamins and minerals. Proper vitamin minerals will help these things function heavily. And this is why we have products like Yeast Lightning, a shameless plug. We find this stuff very useful for a handful of clients, especially if they're making things that, or making worts that don't have a high nutrient content to them already. Vitamins will help you increase the cell health of your culture, or they can allow you to use less cells. It's your call. I would recommend giving you healthier cells. And same thing goes for nitrogen. Now, we typically see nitrogen manifest with malt selection. Now, we have low modified malts, things like Pilsner malts, Bohemian Pils malts, things like the Italian, mainly Pilsner are malts used to make lagers. They're typically less modified, which means they have less available nitrogen to them, which can then starve out these yeast cells. We can buffer that out by doing kind of a standard decoction protein rest, which is why that exists, by the way. Now, if we look at the English malts, or our highly modified malts, they're going to have much more nitrogen to it. Those grains are broken down; they're germinated to a higher degree. This is part of the reason why we typically you see a larger degree of variance when it comes to English ale pitch rates than you do with lager pitch rates, where lager pitch rates are usually very high and very strict, while English ales you have much more to play with. Part of this has to do with how much nutrients are available to the yeast strains. And I can't stress this enough. Pitch rates is a range. You should try to maximize the nutrients available to your yeast cells, increase their cell health, and make the impact pitch rate has on your brew less impactful. That's my opinion. That's my perspective on this. A lot of breweries try to focus heavily on pitch rate and get in a certain number. I want to hit 1.1 million cells per mil per degree Plato. I think you should focus on improving your cell health first. We'll get to that. Now, a few reasons why this, a few examples. Now, say you accidentally underpitched. If you have healthy, well-fed cells, you're okay. The cells are healthy enough to handle that stress and handle that additional work. If we accidentally overpitch, we cut the amount of nutrients each one has available, say by half, by doubling the pitch rate. The cells are still fine. They're happy. They're healthy. They can shoulder the stress, no problem. And if I pitched perfectly, awesome. Excellent. We should see decreased fermentation times and probably better flavor. All of these are beneficial if we focus on increasing cell health. I know I'm probably sounding like I'm beating a dead horse here, but it's really important. Now we'll go through a few questions. What should culture viabilities be? This is a common question we get. And the answer here is never 100%. A yeast cell, as it grows, is going to produce daughter cells. And as those daughter cells leave or remove themselves from the initial cell, which we see here, the mother cell, it's going to create what we call a bud scar. And bud scars will, when they accumulate, will eventually kill the yeast cell. They'll go through senescence and all sorts of things like that. Now, I would, as a general rule, 80% plus viability is a good target. That's a very good target. If you see anything below 70%, I would start reaching out for help. Now, as we see higher generation rates, you may see the viability decrease, which is typically what you see. There are ways to revitalize that culture back up, typically through nutrient and proper air rates. That's a separate lecture. Inferring viability. Now, I mentioned before that there is no easy way for us to measure or assess viability. So how can we infer it? Fairly easily, actually. Monitoring how long it takes the cells to start fermentation and how long fermentation take. Those are some practical gold standards. Not research gold standards, they're practical brewing standards. If you start seeing those start getting elongated and the cell viability stays high, you're probably seeing the vitality of those yeast cells decrease. Now, one other thing you can do is you can look at cell size. It's much more difficult to do. If you are looking at your cells under the scope, you can kind of take a mental picture or use your phone and actually take a picture of it and kind of compare images. Not as practical, but it is a thing you can do if you find yourself wanting to add more. Now, something we also see, similar gravities require different pitching rates. We typically see pitch rates be like 0.1 million cells per mil per degree Plato, which means that everything is standardized based on gravity or what the density is. So we would assume that 2 beers that both start at 1040 would have the same amount of yeast cells needed per heck or per barrel. This isn't uncommon, requiring different amounts. We'll kind of walk you through a little bit. Worts that are made with lager malt typically have a lower nitrogen content and lower vitamin content, might require a higher pitching rate. This is just because there's less available nutrients. Because of the lower nutrient availability, each cell can't handle as much stress. Requires a higher pitching rate. Worts made with roasted barley tend to benefit from higher pitching rates. Some strains don't handle the roasty grains as well. There's also an acid component here that you have to take into account. I don't know a whole much about this, but anecdotally, I know a handful of brewers have benefited from this. And finally, higher adjunct worts tend to benefit from higher pitch rates. Kind of like the first one with lager malts, lower nitrogen availability due to using corn, rice, dextrose syrups, maltose syrups, things like that will result in requiring more. That's all it is. Gravity is a good barometer. It's a good starting point, but there's other things you have to factor in too for pitch rate. Question 4: why do brewers like to focus on pitch rate? This is a bit of an opinion piece here, so I just wanted to put it in, but I think it's important to kind of understand. People like control. People like to focus on things that they have the ability to control on. There's a business/physics research kind of standard that you see out there that says you essentially monitor what you record. So if you can record a thing, you can actually feel like you have influence and control over it, which is true for here too. I think this is why people like pitch rate. Vitality, because it's somewhat you can't analyze it, you can't monitor it, you can't put a number to it. It's easily overlooked, harder to talk about, which is why I think we see everyone focus on pitch rate. I'm not saying pitch rate's not important, but vitality is a huge part of pitch rate that people often overlook. And to wrap this whole thing up, I just want to give a little historical perspective. I know I've said a few things today that might be seen as a little, maybe not quite heretical, but maybe go against the grain a little bit. I want us to look at historical brewing for a little bit. Now, people have been repitching yeast cells for arguably hundreds, if not more, close to thousands of years. We often we hear this from some clients or some potential clients where it's, I don't have the time, money, or knowledge to get a microscope, so I'm not going to repitch. And to be blunt, I kind of think this is crap. And this is not that person's fault. This is what the industry in general thinks. And I would argue that it is wrong. Now, brewers have been repitching yeast cells for hundreds of thousands of years. Not hundreds to thousands of years. There we go. So how'd they do it? Pretty simple. They focused on making the yeast cells happy. They focused on making sure they had healthy, happy ferments. Beers never stopped fermenting. Things were constantly going. They had ample access to oxygen via open ferments. There's intrinsically some things that made these yeast cells very happy. If you focus on yeast cell health, a lot of these other things start to go away. You don't need a scope. You don't need a fancy lab to make sure your repitching works well. There's a few little things you can go through, and that'll allow you to repitch very easily. Now, we're going to have some content come out on this in the next little bit, so keep your eyes peeled. We're going to talk more about when you need and when you don't need a lab or a microscope. You don't need it to repitch. I stand by that statement. And with that, I hope you guys gleaned something. Thanks for taking some time with us with Yeast Basics 2 today. And if you have any questions, leave them in the description down below, and we'll see you guys next time. Cheers.